Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. In this video, I'm going to continue work on Bandai's HGUC Messer Type-F01. Now, in the last video, I got this model built up and painted and gloss coated, ready for all the weathering. And as I'd mentioned in that video, this is a really fun gunpla to build. There's no problems with it. It's really large. It's in terms of lore, this thing is 5 meters taller than your typical Gundam gunpla. So this is a really big mobile suit for an HG kit, but it presents a lot of cool possibilities when it comes to the weathering. Now my plan is to start with some enamel washes for the panel lines and around the raised detail, just to help those stand out a little bit more. All right, for the panel line wash, I've got this Ammo of MiG Deep Brown AMIG 1618, and this is a jar I've actually had for quite a few years. I used this for a long time on aircraft, and it's actually gotten a little thick, a little bumpy, but I like that for gunpla because if you've ever heard of the Bandai plastic bug, what that is, there's a process. As I understand it, there's a process that most models go through when they come out of the mold machine, that they go through a process called baking. Now, I'm not fully clear on whether that's a chemical process or if it's actually baked in some kind of heat. I've heard both from sources that I think are reliable. But Bandai doesn't do that, because whenever you bake the sprues, even the best model companies are, even with the best planning and the best engineering and the best equipment and the best quality control, there's going to be some shrinkage. And it can be as little as 0.5%, but that 0.5% can really affect the fit of a model. So Bandai chooses not to do that, as I understand it, which gives it really good fit, but because the plastic hasn't been baked, it's more susceptible to hotter thinners, especially enamel thinners. So if it gets down into the joints where it can't evaporate, where it can pool up and work on the plastic, if the plastic hasn't been primed or painted or anything, it can cause the plastic to break. I've had it happen one time. I've built a couple of dozen gunpla or more, and I had it happen one time. It only took about 3 minutes. I got some in a peg joint, and I went to articulate the leg to put some wash somewhere else, and it just kind of came apart. The joint came apart in about 3 pieces. Now, I was able to clean it up, glue it back together, and everything worked fine. It's not like it melted it away. It just caused it to break. But it does happen. I say all that to say the reason I like this panel line wash that's gone a little lumpy is that it's not quite as flowy as some others. And so I can touch it to the panel line and it's not going to flow out of control. It's going to pretty much sit there. And that gives me a little bit of an advantage in avoiding the Bandai plastic bug, because I get the benefits of using enamel thinners, which you can wipe them away, you can clean them up like you can with oils, but the drying time is much shorter than it is with oils. Oils sometimes can stay active for a week or more. Most enamels, once you've cleaned it up and give it 24 hours, it's good to go. Now acrylics are even faster, but acrylics you can't go back later and wipe off the excess like I'm going to be able to do with the enamels here. So that's the whole long story of why I'm using this particular bottle. Now it's a good panel line wash, even if it's not gone lumpy. I used it on dozens and dozens of aircraft back when I was building aircraft. So it works nice. The way I kind of work around it being a little lumpy, I've got my lumpy mix right here, and then I've got my thin mix right here. I put just a little bit of thinner, odorless enamel thinner in this one to get it a little bit runnier. And then I've got this much more thin mix over here that it flows more like you would expect a panel line wash to flow. So I can put that in there and get it to spread out. But then I can come back with the thick stuff and just touch it in, and it's going to deposit much more color on that. Now you can do that with oils too. Pre-wet it and then touch it with the color, and it'll flow right through the places that you've pre-wet. But anyway, that's a whole lot of explanation to say I'm going to put some enamel wash on this thing, which is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to get the whole thing covered in the enamel wash, and then I'll come back and show you cleaning that up. Okay, I've given this about half an hour to dry, and cleanup is easy enough. You just go in and wipe it off with a cotton bud. Now, if any of it's a little stubborn and wanting to come up, you can't just keep rubbing at it, but you can get just a little bit of odorless thinner on the end of your cotton bud and roll it around on a paper towel to get most of it off, and then just use the slightly damp cotton bud to get that off. But if you've got a good gloss surface and it's fairly smooth, it should come right up. Now, I tend to wipe it off in the direction that I'm going to end up adding in any streaks later on, so that if any of it streaks, then I'm already just adding streaks essentially. You can also use a brush, a small paint brush, and just dampen that a little bit with thinner if you want to go ahead and start streaking them from this point right here, or manipulating them around, or doing any kind of cleanup in hard to reach areas or something like that. Now, if you've got any areas like that where you wipe it away and there's none left, just go ahead and finish cleaning up everything else, and then go back in and just add a little color right in there with the enamels, and then let it dry and repeat the process. You should be good to go. Now, in an area like that, it's still a little wet. I'm going to let that dry some more, and I'll actually go in there and clean that up with a brush. But it's a fairly easy process of just wiping this stuff away. That's why it's so good. That's why enamels are so good for this, because they have a good balance of ease of use and a fairly quick drying time. They got about a 24-hour drying time before they're in place solid, so they work fairly well. All right, with the panel lining done, I want to go back in and some of the major areas, especially these recesses that are kind of deep right here, and then this area right up in here where there's kind of some vents going on there. What I want to do is I want to add a little more blur, I guess you'd say. Make the grime stand out a little more, have it a little more fuzzy along the edges. I'm going to use another enamel product. It's this AK Interactive Enamel Wash for DAC vehicles. And it's basically the same color as my MIG Deep Brown. They're about the same color. The only difference is this isn't quite as lumpy. It's a little more flowy, and so it fits the purposes of what I want to do. Now, all I'm going to do is get an old enamel brush, or rather an old acrylic brush. I can't speak. An old nylon brush. That's the word John's looking for. I'm just going to stick it in there. I'm going to get some of this on the end of the brush, and I'm just going to go through here and kind of really slap it on there like that. I'm just kind of bouncing back and forth between the edges like that, so that I get a good coat along either side. Now, that's a solid piece of plastic there. That's not a gap there. That's molded in. Same way with up here. And I'm just going to put this a little heavier right up in here, so that I get a good stain started right there. Now, I'm not worried that right now it looks a little tide marky. That's not a problem, because that's how I want to start it off. And then here where there is some pieces that are connected on, I'm going to real carefully just bounce back and forth between the sides. I'm going to try not to get too much on the gap itself, but just get it on either side. And this is where my shaky hand turns to advantage, because when I start dabbing it back and forth like that, sometimes I have trouble stopping. I got to think for a minute and get that to stop. So what this is going to do is give me a way to go back in and dab this around some and really create some grimy looks to it. So I'm going to give that just a few minutes to dry, and I'll show you how I finish that off. All right, that's had a few minutes to dry, about 10 to be precise. And I've got some odorless thinner here that I've been using to clean up for a lot of this work. And I'm going to dip this cotton bud in there, and I'm going to roll off most of it just to get it so I don't want it to be real wet. And then I'm just going to take it and I'm just going to kind of bounce along like that, pushing it back towards the recess. If I wipe some of it up, if some of it comes up, that's okay. I'm not trying to get a complete just smudge the whole way down. I just want it to appear dirty and grimy in that area where that stuff would collect. And you can just add this in if it's not to your satisfaction. If it's not enough when you're done, you can add a little more and go back and put that in. Do this same process. If it's too much, you just keep pushing back at it until you get it cleaned up like you want. It's a real flexible thing. And like I said, you can do this with oils. I actually did something similar to this on the Gelgoog, if you remember, if you watched that series. But I like the way it ends up looking. Now right here where it's a little streaky, I want it to be a little streakier. I'm actually going to pull this down like that and just see what patterns develop. Now remember, I'm working on a gloss surface, and that's deliberate because a gloss surface does not have as much grip, and things are going to wipe off a little easier. I find it easier to keep things in scale on a gloss surface because it doesn't allow things to get too big. You see how those streaks are just very subtle. That's what I'm going for. Now the little bit that's left, I can go back and just dab that along like that. Just kind of push that back into the recesses like I did over on this side. So it's just kind of a back and forth process of adding some in, pouncing along like that, seeing how you like it, and then adjusting it as you go. Now I'll get the rest of this done, and then I'll give it some time to dry, and then we'll move on from there. With the panel lining finished and some staining finished, I want to get started on the chipping. Now when I'm doing chipping, I try to think in terms of, if this were a real world object, what's happening in terms of the layers. In other words, there's some kind of metal or composite, and then over that is either some kind of primer or paint or something like that. And then, like, if there's a composite and then there's primer, then there's the color of paint. And so I try to decide, what does the paint and the primer and all of the layers underneath this and underneath this color, what do they look like? The premise I'm going to be working on is that this, of course, underneath is some kind of metal, future space metal, that's spacey and futury. But and then there's going to be primer over it. Now I'm imagining the primer in my brain to be a darker color, a darker gray kind of primer, and then the paint will be on top of that. Now often the way I'll treat it is that this, like this will be the base color, and then everything else will be painted over the base color. But on this one, I want there to be some contrast, but I don't want to use this base color because it's a Tamiya paint, and it doesn't always work well to do sponge chipping with it. So what I'm going to do is work on the premise that on this lighter part, the first layer of chipping I'm going to do is actually going to be Vallejo Sky Gray. And that's going to represent surface scratches just down to maybe not even fully through the paint to the primer. It's not going to show up a lot, but it will show some. And what it allows me to do is put a little more chipping on the model, because lighter chipping, you can do more lighter chipping than you can do darker chipping and still not look over chipped. So I'm going to start off with the Sky Gray, not only on the light parts, but on the dark parts. Because on these dark parts, the Sky Gray will give really high contrast. So I can go heavier down here with the Sky Gray, but I need to go a little lighter up here so it doesn't look over chipped. Then over the top of this, I'm going to go in with German Gray. And again, I'll do it in both areas. And the German Gray will then become much more pronounced on the light armored sections, and so I'll do that lighter. I won't, by lighter, I mean I won't do as much of the chipping with the darker color. And then because this will go on first on the darker parts, I can go in and touch them with the darker paint. And by keeping the darker paint within the bounds of the lighter paint, and I know this is sounding like a crazy man explaining this, it will allow this dark color to show up with this contrasting paint around it to help it stand out. Hopefully it'll make sense when I demonstrate it, but that's the logic behind it, is that I want to be consistent, that essentially this is the primer color that's underneath everything, and then this is a color that will represent scratches down to the very surface of it, but not fully into the primer. So it won't, the theory won't work as well here, but sometimes with chipping, it's less about, especially on sci-fi things, in my mind, it's less about what's necessarily logical and more about what's going to show up well, what's going to provide some contrast and look good, look cool. That's the goal. So let me get started in this. I'll get everything in my palette, and hopefully demonstration will do a better job of explaining it than my rambling on for the last 5 minutes. Okay, if you've watched my videos, you've seen me do this before, but I've got the Sky Gray here in my palette. I damped off most of it onto this paper towel, and I'm just going to go in and start applying that around the edges. Now, as I had mentioned, it's very, very low contrast. But what it will allow me to do, because it is so low contrast, is build up more chips, especially down here around the lower portion of the leg, that from a distance, it won't look like there's a lot of chips, but when you get up close, you'll start seeing some color variation, which I think will be a good foundation for the darker chips that are going to go over the top then. But I'll just go and do this. And like I said, I'm going to do it heavier on the lower legs because you'd think that's where it's going to get more chipping. In fact, the way I like to do it is on Gunpla, I like to do the chipping on the lower legs, and whatever chipping I do at this stage becomes the guide for how it goes the rest of the way up the suit. As I progress further up the mobile suit, I do less chipping. So I can look back at this and say, okay, well, if that's the amount of chipping that I put there, then I want to do less of that further up on the suit. And by the time I get up to the, to the top of the mobile suit, I tend to not do very much chipping at all. I may do some on the shoulders or the arms where the mobile suit, where the pilot may use the arms or the shoulders to block an attack or something like that. But I want to try and keep it balanced. So you can see how that's looking, Now, if I was doing all of that chipping with dark chips, it would look awful in my opinion. Or it would look awfully worn. It might not look awful if that was the goal I was going for, but doing this low contrast chipping allows me to get a lot more in and get some surface scratches on there that I might not be able to do otherwise. And then when I put the darker ones on there, I can dial those back a bit, and it'll help sell the notion that this is a used piece of equipment. Now on this upper part of the leg here, I have to be a little more careful because of the high contrast here. It can be easy to let this get away from you. So I'm going to be a little more selective about where I do the chipping, trying to keep it within reason. I do want this to look like it's fairly heavily weathered, but not ready for the junk heap. Another benefit of using this approach, where you're using the same color to chip both the dark and the light colors, is while you're chipping one of the colors, if you get it on the other color, it's not really a problem. Like if I get some of this gray down on the lighter part of the armor, well, that's okay. That's just a chip. Same way when I do the chipping with the darker color, if while I'm chipping down here, I get some up here on, across the colors, that's fine also. So I'm going to continue doing this and just get it chipped up with this lighter color, and then switch over to the darker color and show you my approach there. Now that I have the sponge chipping in place, what I want to do is go into this darker section here, and I want to add some larger brush applied chips. And the reason I want to do this is the sponge chips are very, very small, and that's what I wanted, but I need a few bigger chips in here that will have enough room, I guess you'd say, for me to go in with the darker color, so there will be some contrast. So I'm just going to paint in a few areas of larger chipping like this, and I'm just kind of stippling on some chips and some streaks and stuff. But I'll go in and do a few of those. That's going to provide the space that later on I'll come back with a brush with the darker color and paint inside of that. And that will give the darker color a chance to show up on these areas. And this is also a good way of reaching something that you might not have been able to do with the sponge. For example, the sponge, I couldn't get right up along here along the bottom of this armor. So now I can just go in and just touch it up just a bit, if I can see what I'm doing. There we go. It's kind of hard to see how far away the brush is in relation to the model when I'm working around the camera and with my optivisor on, which kind of messes with your depth perception. If you've never used an optivisor, you may hear people say, "Oh, I can't use it because you have no depth. Your depth perception is off." And that is true to a point. After I used mine for a while, it was like my brain adjusted to it, and the problem kind of went away. And now I don't really have too much trouble as long as I have my eyes focused in on it, and I'm kind of close into it. It's a little harder here with the camera, but I actually wear both reading glasses and an optivisor so that I can see what I'm doing. I had cataract surgery a few years back in both my eyes, and so I no longer have my own lenses that can focus on things up close, and so I have to depend on my glasses. But happily, it works most of the time. Sometimes I have to squint a bit. Let me continue doing this, and then we'll move on to doing the darker chipping. Okay, I've got the German gray on my sponge, and I'm just going to go in and begin doing the chipping here. Now, of course, when you're doing chipping, you want to think about where things are going to scrape where parts might rub together, where, as it's stomping along through wherever environment it's at, what's it going to run into. So edges of panels are going to be prime candidates. And you just want to kind of think about, like right here, this thing, when it moves up, it may, impact that. So, or right here along the edge. So that may be an area to put in some chips. Now that's probably an area that I'll need to do with a paintbrush so that I can get to it. That's the kind of thing that you look for. And it just kind of keeps a logic to your chipping so that when you're doing it and you're thinking about, I hope that was in focus, and you're thinking about, well, where do the chips need to go? It gives you a logical way of evaluating it. Well, okay, this thing here, if he's walking through, a forest or a city and he's stomping buildings down, and playing Blue Oyster Cult's Godzilla on his stereo. Boy, that dates me, don't it? But anyway, then, okay, this is going to get scuffed up right here, that area there. Or, just it gives you kind of a basis, a framework for the logic of your chipping. One thing I meant to mention is whenever I'm trying chipping, I generally try to think in terms of scale. What scale are the chips? Because if you look at a piece of equipment, with rare exceptions, most chips are no bigger than somebody's hand generally. Now, there may be a large area, say on a bulldozer or something like that, that's scraped off. But there may be an area that's not much bigger than your hand. Very few are going to be bigger than your head. A lot of them are going to be small, almost, thumb-sized chips. So you have to think in terms of scale. And one of the things that I find helps me when I'm thinking in terms of scale, and I'm reaching around to try and grab something here, is keeping a figure nearby. This is a 1/144th scale figure. And it helps me, I can just put it up next to the model, and it helps me evaluate, okay, is that chipping plausible? Now, if you're not going for plausible, if you're just going for, hey, I want this thing to look wrecked, chip away. But if you're going for plausible, or if it's a real world object and you're going for realistic, having a little figure like this, and I think this figure came from Bandai's AT-AT Walker from Star Wars, but it's the same scale. But having this figure here lets me see, yep, those chips are roughly the size of somebody's hand, and then there's a few that are getting up towards head size. So it just helps keep things in scale. Now, you also have to think about density and distribution. I've already talked a little bit about distribution, where it should be chipped, but also the density, how much. And that's completely subjective. I want this to be a little heavier chip down around the bottom, and then it's going to be less up at the top. And I think it'll just make it more interesting and a bit cool looking. But keeping some of these figures handy in different scales can really help with your chipping. All right, and just like I did with the lighter color chips, after I get the sponge chipping finished, I get some paint on my brush, and I just go in and let me lower my optimizer so I can see what I'm doing. And I just go in and I just add some chips into the middle of these gray areas, just a few of them, just to suggest that darker material down there. And again, this is one of those things that's entirely subjective. You may look at it and decide, I just like the light colored paint, and I'm not going to add any additional chipping to it to make it look deeper, and that's fine. It's whatever you want it to be. It's very much a, they always say Gunpla is freedom, and sometimes I think people take that out of context. But I think for me, when I think about it, it means I can imagine this to be what I want it to be. Now, I'm also going to come down here and I'm going to do some bigger scratches that you can't do with a sponge, like that. This is where it's just had some really severe damage. Something's hit it, something's fallen against it. Maybe as it's walking along, it gets something like that. You put a few of those in. the scratches that I mentioned right here, what I'll do is I'll articulate that part, and I'll just kind of bounce my brush along right there, like that. And so when you move that down, you can see, okay, that's where it's bumped up against that and scraped off the paint. And so I just continue like that across the rest of the model, like along some of these edges where the sponge can't get to it real well. You can just go in and just dance your brush around and get a few chips in there. This also, something I forgot to mention earlier when I was going on far too long about the theory of chipping, this also helps define the edges and volumes of your model, so that along with the staining, it just further helps the details and the shapes stand out. So when somebody's looking at it, they see, oh, there's another facet there, there's another surface there, there's, you know, a change in angle or something like that. And it just helps define the shape of your model. All right, with the chipping pretty much done, I want to start adding some additional stains and streaks to enhance what I've already done with the enamels. And for this, I'm going to switch to Citadel's Nuln Oil. And all I'm going to do, I've got a little in my palette here, and I'm just going to go in with this fine brush. I'm going to do it in different ways. Like in some areas, like if I want a streak, I'm going to put in a streak right here, like this. Just streak that down a little bit. And then in other areas, you can just kind of stipple on a stain here or there so that it can look like some kind of fluid or, you know, environmental, something in the environment splashed up against it. It's not really designed to, I'm not really meaning it to show mud or anything like that. This is more oil leaks or other kinds of fluids, or just surface variation in terms of color. You can also go in at this point with this acrylic product, not making sure that these enamels are fully cured, dried and cured. And you can go in there and just kind of fill in the deeper gaps so that you really just deepen that shadow there. And the acrylics are good for this. Acrylics, if you try to use them like enamels, they'll generally leave tide marks. So you're not able to stretch them and push them around. But they're great for adding in additional shadow and depth and all of that. Like for example along here, I can go in and just trace that in and make sure that that is really deep in terms of shadowing there. So I'm going to go across and do this just in lots of different areas where I think there needs to be some kind of oil streak. Now, one thing I have deliberately not said because I wanted to give it a moment to dry. You'll notice this streak is kind of severe. If this were oils, I could blend it in, right? Well, let me show you something. I can just go in and streak that away. In fact, if I want, I can completely remove it with just a little bit of water on this brush. Now, if you're asking yourself, wait, that's an acrylic, how did you do that? Simple. I added some Liquitex Flow Improver. What this does is it lowers the surface tension. So when you paint this on, it works kind of like an oil. It gives you a little more working time that after it dries a bit, you can do a little bit of blending, a little bit of manipulation of it. If it gets a little too wide, a little too big. So like, I'm deliberately making this more severe, more wide than, you'd probably want to for this type of streak. But I can go back in because of the Liquitex Flow Improver and the glossy surface, and I can do just a little bit of cleanup. Now, it's not as refined a cleanup process as oils or enamels, but if you're working with acrylics, if you're wanting to get the fast drying time of acrylics, if you want to have the lower chemical volatility, I guess you'd say, of acrylics, you can do it. So there's a lot of different ways of of making use of this. You know, I can go in and just start kind of blending that around, and I'm just lightly buffing up against it, kind of blending that in, kind of making it disappear. It doesn't blend, like I said, it doesn't blend quite like oils, but between just the pressure of that and then adding a little water, you can just kind of move it around, do whatever you want to do with it. It's not entirely permanent yet, so you can manipulate it a bit. But it's just a handy little thing to keep in mind. Adding a little bit of flow improver to known oil will help make it a little more flexible in terms of blending and things like that. See how I'm blending this edge in? I'm pushing back to it rather than pulling away from it, but I'm able to refine the look of that streak. And that's doing something more like I would do if I were using oils or enamels. Okay, I got the streaking completed, and I've got the chipping done, and I'm just about done. I went ahead and assembled all the parts so that I could kind of look at it as a whole and see what I thought of it, what I wanted to add. I think I want to add some additional earth effects, some streaking, some dirt, some things like that, just primarily down here on the lower legs, just to represent where, as you know, if it's operating in the earth environment, when it rains, water's going to run down, and there's going to be more of it down here, obviously, because it's running towards the bottom. You know, it always goes downhill. So I'll add some streaking along here and along the feet, just to give it kind of a dirty, dusty look. And at the end of any build, I always just kind of go through and look for, you know, do I need to make any adjustments? Do I need to add any chipping, any streaking? Is there anything I missed? Something I don't like about it that I can, you know, affect a change at this point? So I'll just be kind of looking at that aspect of it too, just the final once over. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with where it's at. I'll add that those earth effects in, and if there's anything else notable that I'm going to add in, I'll certainly mention that. But I'm kind of liking where this guy's ending up. Now, to add a little bit of streaking down on the legs and the feet, I'm going to start with this Vallejo Model Wash Brown, and I've got it in my palette off camera. I realized that the shiny reflective palette really messes with the color balance on the camera, so I'm going to try and do a better job of remembering to keep it off camera where I can. What I want to do is get it on a liner brush like this, and I'm just going to go in and flick it on like that, which produces really, really fine streaks. And I'm just barely letting the end of the brush touch it. And if you're not liking how it's looking, I'm liking how this is looking, but if you're not liking how it's looking, you can real quickly at this point go in and get some water and just kind of brush down from that and clean that up a bit. But I'm liking how this is, so I'm going to go ahead and do this on the feet, the lower legs, places like that. Now on the darker brown color, it's not going to show up as much for obvious reasons. And so I'm also going to mix in some of the Desert Dust Model Wash. Now I'll use it on the leg up here also, so that I don't have, you know, one color on one and one color on the other. I want to have it coherent. But I'll put it on the foot especially, and that will help sell the notion that it's, you know, got some dirt, grime, and things like that have collected on it. And I'll have to go around and flip the model around, do the other side, do the front, the back, and then get him to get into kind of an awkward pose and get on the inner portions of the legs. But I'm just going to go in and continue streaking this on and get that finished up. Just to quickly show the lighter color that's going to go on It's going to be more apparent on the feet. I do the same process, and hopefully you can see, let me move this a little more on camera. Hopefully you can see that this is going to show up a little better than the darker brown did. It's still very, very light. This desert dust, it goes on much more opaque than it actually dries. So you sometimes have to do multiple coats of it to kind of build it up. But it will give a dusty effect, and it works well with this brown, in my opinion. Sometimes I'll actually not only apply the two colors together, but then I'll blend them and get various tones in between, and they just kind of sell the look of dirt and dust, especially in this scale. Because in this scale, you're not going to, it's not like you're building a 35th scale tank where you're going to have just chunks of dirt, in the tracks and all that. And that's realistic. I mean, you see that on a tank. But on a Gunpla, this is 1/144th scale. And that road wheel on a tank is essentially, a little circle that big on this guy. So having chunks of mud is not really gonna, keep a sense of scale. Now, if that's what you want to do, certainly do it. But it's not going to stay within a good sense of scale. So this helps it remain a little more in scale. Now here you'll notice that I'm stippling it on, because my theory is that down towards the bottom of the feet there's going to be much more dust collecting. And what you can actually do is make a mix of this earth, or this brown color, and this desert dust, and put that even along the bottom, because this desert dust will give some contrast for a darker color over the top of it. And you can sell the notion of mud on top of it that otherwise wouldn't show up. So I'm just going to keep doing this. And again, this desert dust, it dries much more transparent than it actually goes on. So you have to kind of account for that. And what I'm doing when the brush goes off camera, I'm wiping off the excess. I'm actually right now, I'm not only spreading it out, but I'm picking up some of the excess so that I can control the look of it. But I'll just continue doing this around the model and get him dusty looking until I'm happy with it. One other thing I meant to point out, when you use this, it dries with kind of a, depending on the color, kind of a satin finish. Now, because this had been glossed before, it will actually appear more matte than it would if I were applying this on a matte product. But I do find that once I get these washes on, I like to go back and give them a light mist coat of a matte top coat, just to get everything down to the same sheen, I guess you'd say, because they can catch light and look a little odd in certain lights because of their finish. So just something to keep in mind. And as you use them, you'll see how they look, and you'll be able to gauge what you want to do in your own usage. Okay, I've got the streaking and the staining on the lower legs completed, and I'm pretty happy with how that turns out. And it just gives it a notion of having walked around in, the earth. Remember, this is something that's 23 meters tall. So when it's, stomping around, if the ground's a little bit muddy or wet or whatever, it's going to splash stuff up. It's going to make quite an impression on the ground. So there's not going to be just some small amount of weathering going on there. So I'm pretty happy with how that looks. All right, well, I think I am going to call the messer completed. made a complete messer of it. Yeah, that was bad. Anyway, this has been a really fun kit to build. I've quite enjoyed it. It doesn't have any vices really in terms of assembly and construction and painting. I mean, it's what you want a gunpla to be. As far as articulation goes, yeah, it's a little bit of a brick. It's so big, and with the skirting on it, you have to really be careful moving it around. So if you're into moving your gunpla around a lot, this will probably not be the greatest kit you've ever worked with. I doubt it would be the worst. But it does what it's supposed to do. It moves around and all. But in terms of the look of it, the assembly of it, it's just great. I wish they were all like this. I really like what Bandai has done with this kit, and it just looks different. It's really cool looking, and it's definitely, even though it's not a Xeon mobile suit, it's definitely got a Xeon look to it. So that heft and that bulk really give it a unique look, and the head design is certainly very different. I heard one person describe it as they thought it looked kind of like a tick. So, you know, whether you see that or not, I don't know. I can kind of see it, but this has really been a fun kit, and I've enjoyed building it and weathering it, and I'm really pleased with how it's turned out. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still here at this point of the video. I am grateful, and I hope you've gotten something from this. If not, maybe some information that will be useful in your own modeling, at least maybe just a little bit of entertainment and diversion that's you've been able to enjoy. So thank you for watching this. Now, of course, the usual stuff which you expect at the end of anybody's video. There's the subscribe link down here. If you've not already subscribed, I would be grateful if you would click that button and hit the little bell icon next to it so that you'll be notified when I have new videos coming out. Down below in the description, there are also links to the social media that I'm on and to my blog. If you've not checked out my blog, I invite you to do so. While I've only been doing YouTube videos publicly in a real strong sense just this year, 2020. I did some in 2019, but I've really been hitting it hard in 2020. I've been blogging for quite a while, and if you want to check out my blog down below, the link down below, there's quite a bit of material there that you may find interesting, so I invite you to check that out. There's also a link to Patreon. If you would like to support me and the work that I do, I would invite you to check out Patreon and see the various levels that are offered there. And I would greatly appreciate your consideration in that. If you're already a patron, thank you so much. You make this possible, because otherwise I could not afford to do the modeling at the pace that I do, with the materials and kits that I do, and the various venues that I do, if it weren't for your support. Just couldn't do it. So I'm very grateful for that. And as I always like to do, I'll leave you with one final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.